I am amplified. Yeah, definitely. Good deal. Good morning. I hope everyone is having a good weekend so far, and we appreciate everyone being here. As is our custom, before we get started, we're going to begin with a word of prayer. And John, do you mind leading us in that prayer? Amen. All right, so we're hoping to have a little more continuity and regularity moving forward. As Grant is now here full time, and now I am here semi full time. So there'll be a little less bouncing around. And as we were divvying up how we were going to separate the duties for this time period, at least, I'm going to be taking the Sunday morning class. And so I was considering what to study for the next, I believe it's about, 17 weeks? Is that about right? I think it's something like 17 weeks. There is a claim that the Church of Christ makes, and I use that as a broad term. I'm not, singling out an individual church, but there's a claim that the Church of Christ in general makes with regard to who we are. And I know this is kind of a vague question with a very specific answer that I'm looking for, but can anyone tell me what that claim is? The true church. That's about as good of an answer as you can get. Yeah. So we make that claim. Why? Sola Scriptura. Yes. We believe that if it's not in the Scriptures, we can't do it. And if it is in the Scriptures, we got to do it. So that's how we make that claim, that we are, kind of the spiritual heirs of the first century church, is that we try to emulate them in all that we do, right? And we do that by doing our best to follow the Scriptures. But it's hard to do that without having a somewhat unified understanding of the Scriptures, which we understand is no easy task, right? So several years ago, there was a book written by a man by the name of F.F. Bruce. Don't ask me what the F stand for. I have no idea. But the name of that book was called The Hard Sayings of Jesus. And it was kind of a double entendre, right? Because some of Christ's teachings are literally hard to understand. It's hard to parse out exactly what's being said. But then others are fairly easy to understand, but they're hard to obey. And whether that means it's hard to accept or hard to implement, they're still hard to obey. All right? And so, in that respect, while I do intend to discuss the former, which is hard to understand to some degree, it's the latter that I want to focus on for at least several weeks. And that is things that are fairly easy to understand, at least in general concepts, but are hard to implement in our lives. And so, the first thing that I would ask regarding that is, some of these sayings, we think that we have a good grasp of them, but do we truly understand these sayings as much as we think we do, right? And then, of course, other questions that I want us to be considering this morning are like, how do we apply these teachings, these sayings that Jesus had? How should we apply them? And are we getting the original intent that Jesus had when he made these sayings? And so with that being said, this morning we're going to look at a very familiar passage in Matthew chapter 5, and it's verses 38 through 42. And before we read that, I'm going to ask, is anyone familiar with the phrase lex talionis? Lex talionis. It's Latin, literally means the law of retaliation. Right? So keeping that in mind, would someone like to read Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42?
You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak too. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away.
Is there anyone present who does not have their own personal understanding of what this verse means? I didn't figure so. It's pretty straightforward. Now let me ask you this. Is there anyone present who has encountered someone else who understands this set of verses differently than you do? That's what I was getting at when I mentioned that sometimes, we don't have a mutual understanding of what these verses mean. Right? It's very simple here. He says, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also, right? Turn the other cheek. That's where we get the phrase, turn the other cheek. That's a simple phrase, but how do we apply it? Well, I wanted to first look at where it says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Jesus says in multiple times in this passage, he says, you've heard it said. And a lot of the things that he says that you've heard it said, they're hearing these from the Pharisees, but they don't actually come from the law. But this particular one actually does. This comes from the law. The first example of that, and I'm going to give out these 3 verses. If someone would turn to Exodus 21:24. If someone else would turn to Leviticus 24:20. And then last, if someone would turn to Deuteronomy 19:21. So if someone would read for us Exodus 21:24.
Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot.
Okay. So this is Moses giving out the law. And here we have that phrase, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? And then that is elaborated in Leviticus 24 and verse 20.
Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has caused disfigurement of a man, so shall it be done to him.
All right, so now we have a little bit more elaboration. If you injure someone wrongly or wrongfully, then the same thing shall be done to you. Matter of fact, it goes on to talk about if you do this to someone's slave, you have to free them. It's balance, right? The old law was very balanced in its approach to justice. If someone would get Deuteronomy 19:21.
Show no pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot.
And again, all 3 of these verses are part of greater passages discussing how justice was to be implemented under the old law. But what I want us to get for it is that Jesus is actually quoting the Old Testament here. This was the law under Moses and the prophet.
Good clarifier, and I think this gets to Jesus' point because he mentions it because people are receiving it.
Yes.
Is that this is not personal stuff.
No.
This is like a law code, like the whole community of Israel. This is the kind of thing they do. So if someone assaults another person and injures them,
Right. It's not vigilante justice. And I should have clarified that, and thank you for that. But, if you back up in Deuteronomy, since we're there, Deuteronomy 19:18, it says, the judges shall investigate thoroughly. And of course, it goes on to discuss false witnesses, but that's not the only place that it mentions the judges and their responsibility. This was, to be handled through their version of a court, pretty much. And justice was to be meted out based on the judge's ruling. And so, but they had taken that and they'd taken out the phrases that we just read, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. And they had pulled that out of context and were using it to justify wronging each other, pretty much, is what's going on back in Matthew. Now, and so Jesus says, hey, this is what you've heard. This is what I want you to do. All right, and he goes into the famous turn the other cheek quote. So, he makes kind of a radical change here. It's not just a radical change from what the Pharisees were telling them.
In verses 38 through 42, didn't that tell you to go the second mile?
It does. The whole idea. So that's actually an interesting question. So where does that come from? What is he talking about when it says go the extra mile? Yes.
So Roman soldiers would walk up to Joseph and force them to take their pack, but he could only force them to carry his load with him, but they could only force it for a mile.
Correct.
The thought, what's being said is, they force you to take it a mile, go ahead and extend beyond that and take it to you.
So being a Roman soldier, you're in full body armor. And you have a pack if you're traveling, and so there's a lot of weight, and it's hot. It's the Middle East. I'm sure, I imagine the weather wasn't much different then than it is today, which is hot and arid. And so they were allowed under Roman law to compel a citizen to carry their pack and their armor up to a certain distance. And what Jesus is saying is, that may not necessarily be right, and you may not like that they do this, but what he's saying is if they compel you to do this, go the extra mile, right? Go further than they require of you. Just like if someone slaps you, turn to him the other cheek, right? It's this idea, and it's this radical idea. All of these would have been considered radical at the time, that it's not, you don't do wrong to someone because they wrong you, but it's this idea that if someone wrongs you, you're going to respond better, right? You're going to deal with it better. You're not going to, for example, if someone slaps you, the initial reaction, I imagine for most of us, is violent, right? Let's just be realistic about it. That's your knee-jerk reaction is to respond in kind, and that was pretty much what the Pharisees were saying you had a right to do under the old law. And even under the old law, you could go to a judge and get justice for that. But he's saying, don't even do that. Right? So this was a radical thought process for Jews at the time. And I don't think it's any different for us today. So I want us to look at two thoughts regarding the turn the other cheek passage. How did they apply it in the first century? And how do we apply it today? So that begins with a clear understanding among the group here. What does it mean to turn the other cheek? I'm curious. I want to get different thoughts because I'm sure we're not all thinking the same thing when you read that passage. So what does that mean? That's pretty concise, yeah. Anyone else?
And it's also
I would go as far as to say show grace. Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else want to weigh in? Personal thoughts?
Considering that, like the Pharisees were making it, it was like someone's legal right to retaliate, and Jesus says, "Don't do that." It's sort of putting this idea that Jesus is communicating and putting it above your land's law.
Yes.
Like, even if you have the right, you don't do it.
Well, and that, verse 40, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, well, if you want to sue someone, you have to go through the law, right? Otherwise, it's just stealing. So yeah, absolutely. And that's another thing that we will get into, but since he touched on it, I'll bring it up briefly, is render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's, right? That's another hard saying of Jesus. At least to me it is. Okay, because sometimes it's hard to parse out religion and politics, right? Jesus obviously dealt with that back then. He was dealing with it when he referenced that. But sometimes it's hard to parse out how the two blend. And that's something that I definitely want to discuss in this class. But for now, with regard to turn the other cheek, I would absolutely say it's the opposite of lex talionis, which is the law of retaliation. As Grant said, it is the law of unretaliation, for lack of a better term. But so.
But I think it goes a step beyond, because it's not just don't like that, it's allow more.
Well, and so that's the question, right? So when it comes to turn the other cheek, is this a command for total pacifism? And this is a question that is debated among the church today. Is this a command for total pacifism? And I'm not saying that I believe one way or the other. I want to know what your thoughts are regarding that. I see you shaking your head.
No, because I don't believe that we're ever told to be passive. Jesus came to the temple, turn over the tables. So there are times when you have to stand up for what's right.
Turn to John chapter 2.
While we're turning there, can I bring up another passage?
I hope you do.
When Jesus is talking to his disciples,
Don't bring that up yet. No, you're going to Luke 22, right? Yeah, don't bring that up yet. We're going to get there. All right, let's get through John 2 first. I had a feeling that's where you were going. So John 2, 13 through 16, if someone would like to read that.
In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And he poured out coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold pigeons, "Take these things away, do not make my father's house a house of prayer."
Okay. I'm glad that she brought this up, because obviously I was planning to go here. So, when we discuss the idea of turning the other cheek, the obvious question is, what are the limits, right? Where are you supposed to draw a line in the sand and say no more? And so, when discussing this idea, proponents of action, so to speak, of when to take action, right? Me included, because I have brought this up in discussions before, go to John chapter 2 here. And what we have is I would honestly say the only violent act that we see Jesus commit in the entirety of the New Testament. 4 Gospels written, this is the only one that I know of. Grant, you may be able to correct me, but yeah, I think this is the only one. This is the only time where we see Jesus, quote unquote, take up arms and go after the Pharisees. Now, he goes after them verbally quite a bit. I mean, Matthew, was it 24? He really goes after them. But But this is the only time he gets physical. And so when applying that to turn the other cheek, we have to look at what's going on in this situation. So obviously, Jesus never committed sin. We know that. So he takes up arms here against the money changers and the people who are involved at the temple doing these things. As a matter of fact, he says, my Father's house is not a place of business, pretty much, right? So what are the key factors in this situation that make it special?
It's his house. It's his own house, it's his own place. He's not coming into some place that has nothing to do with him really. He says it's my Father's house, and we know that Jesus himself is God.
Mhm.
The temple is his house. So he is acting on behalf of himself, essentially, for his own property.
I'm also thinking about Micah 6:8 says he, the Lord, has told you only what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to love kindness, to walk under your God. And when we're looking at in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, as we call it, Jesus is not correcting the things that were said before, as in these are wrong. He's saying you took these and you took them to a place they didn't belong, where justice, here justice comes to you the word, the justice and mercy and morality. And so the retaliation issue, some circumstances require justice and some circumstances require mercy. And where we get into a sticky point is, okay, am I retaliating because I feel slighted or because that's the right thing to do? Justice is not I feel slighted and I'm going to take it out on them. Justice is I'm going to step in where somebody's being taken advantage of. Or I'm going to step in where something is being done that is unjust. And sometimes that means we step up for ourselves. I think more often just we see something happening and we step in where we are not involved. We're not the one being harmed. We're not always the one. Because when you're in that position, you don't have power. Like if Grant was beating me, I don't have the power to tell him to stop, right? That's not something in my power, but somebody else can step in and say, what are you, that's not appropriate, that's not what
Right.
we're called to do. And so it's a fine line, and I think Jesus is highlighting there is a line. It is not just my third eye, oh, I'm gonna take your eye out. It's justice comes before.
And a lot of times it's to prevent future acts. That justice is, you can't stop what happened in the past, but you can correct behavior in the future. I say, no, that's not right, stop doing that, don't do that.
And I think that gets to the reason why that law was given, because there's a difference between saying, you killed one of my oxen, so one of your oxen has to die. That's just fair. And Lamech saying, I killed a man because he hurt me, or I killed a young man because he offended me, you know? Like, Lamech murdered a person because he felt slighted.
Right.
So there's that difference between what is fair and what is overkill, literally. And that law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, is given not to give you permission to retaliate, but to say that is as far as it goes. You cannot go beyond what was done to you.
Right.
So if you just insist on, what's the phrase? Insist on your kind of flesh. That's it. You don't go beyond that.
Right.
If someone runs over your cat, you cannot assault them. Right? However, no,
No, but they might say that you could kill them over the cat. People feel strongly about their animal, and I'm being one of them. I own 2 dogs and a cat, and I'm very attached to my animals, so I can understand the sentiment. But and I think that goes back to the initial reaction when we are slighted is to respond in kind, and that's the idea that Jesus is getting at when he talks about turning the other cheek or not suing your neighbor or going the extra mile and things like that is this idea that we are to behave differently, right? We are called to be different as Christians. We're called to think differently. And so when you have a situation like John 2, where you see Jesus draws a line, he says, you're not going to do this. This is not okay, all right? I would go as far as to say this is a violation of God's law. What was going on in the temple was a violation of God's law. And that is what caused Jesus to stand up. And that may be, yeah.
And to clarify, what they're doing, like selling sacrifices for the money from the people who can't bring animals themselves and selling animals to them, that's not itself against the law because God says there should be that going on. But it's supposed to be outside the temple.
Right.
Right? They're doing it inside their temple. And Jesus comes to that and says, that is wildly inappropriate.
Right.
You cannot be doing that in here. This is the place where people worship. This is the place where people sacrifice. You can't be doing business in here and sort of drive around.
Right, it's a house of worship. And that's the purpose of it. And they have turned it into essentially a money changer. And so obviously we get from this passage that there are lines that need to be drawn. But, and I would use this case as an example when considering this question, is that a line that we draw or is that a line that God draws?
There's not every situation, every exact situation. It's not what the Bible doesn't say. Okay, this is God doesn't mind, here's the line, and this is. So we have to decide.
And actually, when it comes to interpretation of scriptures, there's actually a phrase called necessary inference, right? That's how you decide biblical authority when there's not a specific example given. So
This kind of relates to your question, and it's kind of just like stuff.
that's fine.
I feel like it's worth noting here, because I'm just thinking, okay, from mental health standpoint.
Sure.
Okay, when there are different parts of our brain and literally every physiology that activate when a threat comes up, right?
Sure.
So when a threat comes up, the logical, rational part of my brain is not on, and therefore I will retaliate because that part of my brain that goes, wait, this is not the kind of person that I am, is not on mine.
Right.
So I'm not going to make the choice that I make. And so I'm thinking about this like, okay, you have to be at a point, like you have to be, your body has to be in a certain state in order to respond to somebody like that, right? And so even like if somebody asks you a mile, you go 2, that often turns into, well, like I have to go the extra mile, and that becomes, I'm not making a logical choice. I'm making I'm fearful of doing the wrong thing if I don't give more than I have, and then it perpetuates a negative cycle of people are giving more than they have. They are effectively in like a victim position, and that is not what Jesus is talking about. This
No.
is a rational choice that I make. And when somebody slights me, when somebody does something wrong against me, if my retaliation comes out, it is no longer just their fault, like their error, but it is also my error. Versus if I am, these were regulated to the word that I
No, I understand. Yeah.
But if I'm regulated, I can accept that you hurt me, and I'm not going to hold it against you because that's your error, that's not my error.
Right.
And I can have this like what we would call it class, like, right? You did this, I have an did something, I have a right to retaliate and I'm not going to. And now all of a sudden the other person feels the weight of, oh, that wasn't right. I shouldn't have done that. And then taking it full circle. I think that that's what makes this hard, is that it is very natural that we are sighted and we respond a certain way because in our bodies.
Yeah.
We're designed to do that. And Jesus is calling us to take self-control, control of our minds, control of our bodies. To
Yes.
recognize, just because I've been sighted does not mean that I have to retaliate, but that a lot of times takes an actual practice on my part of learning how to put pause so that I react the way that I want to.
And to build off of that, that is a practice of self-control. And the thing that comes before the self-control is the knowledge, the internalizing what the Bible says.
Mm-hmm.
Goldie mentioned this yesterday. She asked this, and she asked, what do we do when we don't have the Bible? So I said, you mean like if something happens and you don't have the Bible with you to see what it says about it? And I told her, well, that's why we study the Bible, so that we know what to do in these situations before they happen. That's the knowledge part that informs the self-control thing.
Mm-hmm.
When someone slights us, we can't just pause and say, all right, let's have a Bible study real quick.
Right.
You know,
Right. Got to figure out how I need to respond to this. Yeah.
we have to internalize what the Bible says before we get into these situations.
Well, what did Jeremiah say? I'll write it on their hearts, right? And that's the idea. And to your point, where it's like, well, you know, there's not an example for every situation. That's very true, but there is a general concept. And so, you know, years ago there was the phrase, "What would Jesus do?" Well, that's kind of the idea. We take the concept that Jesus provides, we apply them to every situation.
People talk about the difference between the letter of the law and the
Spirit.
of the law. And it's really unfortunate that oftentimes they do that as things that are opposing one another. Because how do you know the spirit of the law?
Right.
You read the letter of the law, and that informs you what the spirit of the law is. What's the idea? Like,
Right.
why does God command the Israelites to build handrails on the roofs?
Right. Right.
It's because the spirit of the law involves you should love your neighbor as yourself. You should care about the safety of other people. So, if you got a roof that people can walk on, you put handrails on.
Right.
It's the spirit of the law.
Well, and that's kind of why the Old Testament law was so specific, is to provide guide rails, right? Right. It's like, okay, it helped them narrow their focus to understand what God wanted, and of course, they missed it, which led to the whole problem, which is why, you know, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus kind of redirects them back to the whole point of the old law, you know, which was learn God, learn what God wants. What does Ecclesiastes say? Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. And they missed it. And we do too. Like it is inevitable that we miss things on occasion. And so, you know, when looking at a situation like John 2, you know, which gives us an example of the application of turn the other cheek, or the parameters of turn the other cheek, you have to say, okay, what's going on here? Why did Jesus respond this way? And how can we apply that? And that's really what I'm getting at. I don't want to say, well, you have to turn the other cheek in every situation, or you don't have to turn the other cheek in certain situations. What I want to say is, let's look at how things are applied. Now, he brought up something, and we've got just a few minutes left, and I want to cover it because it's important. Luke 22, 36 through 38. And Grant, since you brought this up, do you want to read it?
Is it 36 through 38?
I believe so, yes.
He said to them, but now he who has a money bag, let him take it, and likewise a napkin He who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say to you that this which is written must so be accomplished in me. And he was numbered with the transgressors, for the things concerning me have an end. So they said, Look, Lord, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, It is enough.
Have at it.
This one is the passage that is essentially about self-defense.
Yes.
Right? This is a time when Jesus knows that it's going to become very dangerous for his disciples, for the apostles, and they have a very important purpose.
Right.
They are supposed to carry on his teachings after him. They cannot just die, right? So he said,
Right.
He's saying, this is about to be a dangerous time. I am about to be numbered with the transgressors. And at the same time, the Jews are going to be looking for his followers too. They are going to need to scatter, they're going to need to hide. And he says, go ahead and get yourself a sword. Essentially meaning, get yourself something to defend yourself if need be. And we know that none of them actually encountered that situation as far as we know. But you need to have that protection. We know that Peter uses the sword.
Oh, we're getting there. We're going to get to that.
The servant of the priest, when he comes to arrest Jesus, but Jesus says, no, Peter, put your sword away. The one who lives by the sword dies by the sword. So we need to take both of these ideas in mind. We have this passage here about self-defense. You know, when things are getting dangerous, you equip yourself to be safe.
Mhm.
But that doesn't give us the right to just be really itching to use it. You know what I mean?
I do,
And he also
because
says, when they say, here's 2 swords, and he says, that's enough. There are 12 guys here.
Mhm.
2 swords is enough. He's not saying like everybody should have something, but he's saying that, you know, as followers of Jesus, we should, as a group, have something.
No.
And it doesn't have to be a lot.
well, you know, you had Simon the Zealot who could probably use both swords to extreme effect. So, you know, but no, and that's exactly right. So Luke 22 is kind of a dichotomy of 2 situations that I think really give you your left and right limits of turn the other cheek. Like he says in verses 36 through 38, you know, Jesus literally tells them, hey, make sure you've got some swords. Things are about to get a little sketchy, right? And he even says, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one, right? Start selling your clothes off because you're going to need this sword more than you're going to need the cloak, right? And then very shortly after that, a matter of hours later, a prime opportunity comes up for the apostles to use said swords. And, you know, you can argue turn the other cheek prior to Jesus, you know, rebuking Peter for this. You can argue one way or the other, but he's using his sword to defend the Christ. You know, most of us would feel that that's a pretty legitimate reason to use a sword if you're going to have one, right? And remember, just a few hours ago, Jesus has said, you know, you need to be armed. And yet here we are, a prime opportunity to use these arms, and Jesus says, no. This is not the time. And he puts the guy's ear back on, which would have been, you know, something to see in and of itself, and tells Peter to put his sword away. And the interesting thing here is that Peter's not arrested. You know, he attacks this guy in front of Roman soldiers, and he's not arrested, but which was weird. But yeah, so I agree. There are situations of self-defense, but it's also, you know, it's not every situation. In fact, most situations, I would say, we are called to turn the other cheek. We are called to be different from the society that we live in, a society of, for lack of a better term, violence. You know, violence for violence, blood for blood, right? That has not changed Since 2,000 years ago, when Jesus was quoting the Old Testament, society has not much changed. If we're wrong, we want to wrong someone else. It's just a natural human instinct, as she was getting at. It's when you are threatened, there is a flight or fight response, right? You either want to run away from the threat or you want to retaliate. That's a natural human response. And what Jesus is calling us to do in Matthew 5 is to get control of ourselves. And I think that's exactly what she was hinting at, is that we need to control our response. Sometimes a response is warranted, and I think these passages demonstrate that. But our response needs to be measured, and we need to weigh our response against the Scripture. And I think that is the clue that we are done. Any final comments or questions? Okay, thank you for your attention.